she whispered. "I'm exhausted pretending this relationship still has a future," during a conversation we'd been avoiding for months. I calmly packed my things and left that evening. 11 months later, she sat speechless watching a mutual friend introduce my new fiancé at the same restaurant where we ended everything. The candles between us had burned down to stubs by the time she said it. "I'm exhausted pretending this relationship still has a future." 6 words. Quiet. Not angry. Almost relieved, like she'd been holding her breath for months and finally let it out. I didn't say anything at first. The restaurant noise kept going around us. Silverware, laughter from the bar, a waiter asking someone if they wanted another round. Raylan's eyes were on the tablecloth, tracing the seam where 2 panels met, like she'd rehearsed this moment and needed somewhere safe to look. I wasn't shocked. That was the strange part. I felt my chest tighten, but somewhere underneath that, a voice that had been whispering for months finally got loud enough to hear. "You already knew." The relationship wasn't ending tonight. It had ended a long time ago. Tonight was just the confession. "Okay," I said. She looked up, surprised I wasn't fighting her on it. "Okay. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel it too." She exhaled, and something in her shoulders dropped that I don't think had been at ease in a year. "I want to tell you I handled the rest of that night with some kind of grace I'd practiced. I didn't practice it. I just didn't have anything left to argue for." We paid the check. I walked her to her car. I told her I'd come by for my things that evening, and she nodded like she'd expected that too. I had no idea, sitting in my own car outside that restaurant with my hands still on the wheel, that 11 months later I'd be standing in that same building again, and she'd be the one who couldn't speak. Raylan and I had been together 3 years. We'd moved in together after year 1, into a 2-bedroom in a converted mill building outside Hartford, the kind of place with exposed brick and a landlord who never fixed the heat fast enough. We talked about a house. We talked about a dog. At one point, 18 months in, we talked about a ring, in that hypothetical way people do when they're still convinced the conversation is exciting rather than terrifying. I believed in all of it. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where I was secretly checked out too, just waiting for an exit. I wanted it to work. I think that's part of why I didn't see what was happening. I was too busy holding on to the version of us I'd decided was still true. Looking back, there were signs. Small ones. The kind you wave off because admitting what they mean costs more than ignoring them. She'd stopped asking about my day in a way that wanted an actual answer. Conversations about the future got shorter, vaguer, more like maintenance than excitement. We'd had a couple of real arguments that fall, not about anything huge, but about things that mattered, things that needed actual conversations, and both times, we'd let them dissolve into silence instead of resolution. We told ourselves we were giving each other space. Really, we were just avoiding the work. I didn't realize it then, but there was one night, months before the restaurant, that changed everything. I didn't see it for what it was at the time. I wouldn't understand it until much later, after the dust had settled and I had the distance to actually look at it clearly. By that September, the apartment had gotten quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. My best friend Stetson noticed before I let myself admit it out loud. We were at his place watching a game, and during a commercial break, he just looked at me and said, "You good?" "You and Raylan." "We're fine," I said, in the automatic way you say things you're not sure are true anymore. He didn't push it. Stetson's not a pusher. But he gave me a look that said he didn't believe me, and honestly, I'm not sure I believe me either. Raylan's best friend Palmer noticed too. Raylan told me later, in the conversation where everything finally got said, that Palmer had asked her outright if she was happy. Raylan hadn't had an answer. We weren't fighting. That's the part people don't expect. We weren't a couple in crisis, screaming at each other, slamming doors. We were a couple in decline, which is quieter and somehow worse, because there's no single moment you can point to and say that's when it broke. It's 100 small absences. The conversation you don't finish. The plan you don't make. The "how was your day?" that gets a one-word answer and neither of you follows up. One night in October, I asked her if she wanted to look at apartments closer to her work, something we talked about for months. She said, "Maybe later," in a tone that wasn't really about timing. I remember sitting with that sentence after she'd gone to bed, turning it over, trying to figure out why it had landed like a door closing instead of a postponement. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. The truth came out, eventually, in pieces, mostly after the breakup, in the handful of conversations we still had while untangling our shared lease and shared friends. But the real turning point, the one neither of us named while it was happening, went back to August. My grandmother had passed that month. It hit me harder than I expected, and the week of the funeral, I needed Raylan in a way I hadn't needed anyone in a long time. She came to the funeral. She stood next to me. But in the weeks after, when the grief didn't conveniently end on schedule, I noticed she'd started changing the subject when I brought it up. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Like grief was a task with a deadline she needed me to hit. I never told her how much that hurt. I told myself she was trying her best, that not everyone knows how to sit with someone else's pain, that I shouldn't expect her to read my mind. All true, but I also never gave her the chance to actually understand what I needed, because I never said it. I just quietly filed it away as evidence in a case I wasn't yet willing to admit I was building. She told me later, calmly, without defensiveness, in the kind of honest conversation we should have had in August instead of November, that she'd felt shut out that whole month, that I'd gone somewhere inside myself she couldn't follow, and instead of asking her to come with me, I'd just let her stand outside the door. We were both right. That's the part that took me the longest to accept. It wasn't a villain story. It was two people who loved each other and still managed to fail each other in quiet, ordinary ways, until the failures piled up higher than the love could reach. Which brings us back to that table, 3 months later, candles burning down. After she said it, I didn't ask her to take it back. I didn't ask what we could fix. I think some part of me had been waiting for someone to finally say the sentence out loud so we could both stop pretending. Can I ask why now? I said, not accusing, just wanting to understand. She told me. About August. About feeling like she'd been trying to reach me for months and kept finding the line busy. About how exhausted she was carrying a hope that nothing in our daily life was supporting anymore. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I told her my side. The door I'd closed without telling her. The things I should have said and didn't. We weren't arguing. We were finally just talking, 3 months too late to save anything, but in time to end it with some dignity. I don't want this to be ugly, she said. It won't be, I told her. And I meant it. I went home that night, packed what was mine into the back of my car, and left the key on the kitchen counter. Stetson let me crash on his couch for the first 2 weeks. Neither Raylan nor I made a scene to our friends. We didn't badmouth each other. We just quietly let something in that had already been over for longer than either of us wanted to admit. Neither of us, I think, expected that restaurant to be the last chapter of us. But it was. The first month was the hardest, in the unglamorous way breakups actually are, not dramatic, just hollow. I went to work. I came home to Stetson's couch. I stared at my phone more than I'd like to admit. But somewhere around week 6, something shifted. I stopped checking if she'd texted. I started sleeping through the night again. I threw myself into work. My coworker Bridger had been after me for a year to take point on a project I'd been too distracted to pursue properly, and I finally said yes. My mentor Cade, who'd been quietly patient with me through a year of being only half present, started actually investing real time in me again once he saw I was showing up. I started running again, something I'd let slide for 2 years. I started cooking instead of ordering in. Small things, none of them dramatic. But they added up the same way the silences with Raylan had added up, except this time, in the other direction. By spring, I'd been promoted. By summer, I didn't recognize the version of myself from the previous October. Not because I'd transformed into someone unrecognizable, but because I'd quietly become the person I'd stopped being somewhere in the middle of that relationship, present, engaged, actually showing up for my own life. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. That's when I met Bristol. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning bolt. Bridger had dragged me to a friend's barbecue in June, and Bristol was there, a friend of the host. And we ended up talking for 2 hours about nothing important and everything interesting. She asked good questions. She actually listened to the answers. When I told her about my grandmother, she didn't change the subject. She asked what she'd been like. I wasn't looking for a relationship. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a rebound story. We were friends for months before anything else. We texted, we got coffee, we showed up for each other in ordinary ways. It built slowly, the way good things tend to. By the time Bristol and I admitted we wanted to be more than friends, it didn't feel like starting over. It felt like continuing something that had been quietly building the whole time. What surprised me most wasn't the chemistry, it was the ease. When I had a hard week, she asked about it and stayed in the conversation. When I needed space, I could tell her that without it becoming a whole negotiation. We argued sometimes, the way any two honest people do, but we actually finished the arguments instead of letting them go quiet and rot. I hadn't realized, until I had it, how much effort it takes to be in a relationship where effort is actually noticed, where the things you do for someone land instead of disappearing into a silence you can't read. Meanwhile, through the loose web of mutual friends that survives any breakup, word filtered back to Raylan occasionally. That I'd been promoted, that I looked good, that I was seeing someone. At first, apparently, she didn't think much of it. Then, according to Palmer, she started asking more questions than the updates really warranted. I wasn't trying to make a point. I wasn't performing a comeback for an audience. I was just living a life that had, gradually, become mine again. But somewhere out there, a date was approaching that none of us had planned around each other, and it was going to put us all in the same room. Bellamy's engagement party landed on a Saturday in October, almost exactly 11 months after that last dinner with Raylan. I hadn't thought twice about the venue when Bristol mentioned it, until we walked in and I recognized the brick archway over the bar. The same restaurant. I felt my stomach tighten for a second, then let it go. It was just a building. I wasn't the same person who'd walked out of it 11 months ago, and I wasn't going to let four walls and some string lights dictate how my night went. Raylan was already there, near the back with Palmer, when Bellamy spotted us coming in and waved us over with the easy enthusiasm of someone who didn't think anything of it. "You guys made it," Bellamy said, pulling Bristol into a hug like they were old friends, even though they'd only met once before. Then, to the small cluster of people near the bar, Raylan among them, Bellamy said it simply, without any idea of what the sentence would do to the room. "This is his fiancée, Bristol." I watched it land on Raylan's face in real time. The glass in her hand didn't move. Her eyes went from Bristol, to me, to the room around us. The same tables, the same low lighting, the same bar where I'd once asked for the check on a night neither of us had wanted to finish. She didn't say anything for a second too long. "Congratulations," she finally managed, and her voice was steady, but something behind her eyes wasn't. The party went on around her. Toasts were made. Someone put music on. Bristol laughed at something Bellamy said, easy and unguarded, her hand finding mine without thinking about it, the way it does when something has actually settled into place. I noticed Raylan sitting a little apart from the noise, her drink mostly untouched, her eyes drifting back to our table more than once. I didn't go over to gloat. I didn't need her to see anything. There was no satisfaction in her discomfort. If anything, I felt something closer to quiet sympathy, the kind you feel for an old chapter of your life that's still standing in the rain while you've already gone inside. I heard later, from Stetson, that she left not long after, telling Palmer she had an early morning. I don't think that was true. I think she just needed to be somewhere that wasn't the place where she'd once decided a future wasn't worth pretending about anymore, only to watch that exact future quietly hand itself to someone else, in the same room, 11 months later. I didn't think about her much after that night. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because my attention was somewhere better, on Bristol, on the wedding we were slowly planning, on the version of my life that had built itself, brick by brick, out of the wreckage of the one I'd lost. The future Raylan had stopped believing and became someone else's beginning.